After ignoring the need for a federal anti-corruption body for years, the Morrison government in 2018 finally announced that they would introduce a body called the Commonwealth Integrity Commission. Problem solved. Thanks for watching, please subscribe. But it's not that simple. If you haven't checked out part 1 of this series, link is in the description. Labor had announced in early 2018 that they would create a strong integrity commission if they won the next election. And by November of that same year, an independent member of parliament introduced a bill to create an anti-corruption body. The Liberal National Government was losing control of the narrative, so they had to act. And what they did was to announce the creation of a new body, which according to Scott Morrison,
this is a real proposal with real resources, real teeth.
This was weeks after calling an integrity commission a
fringe issue, Mr. Speaker,
and the Deputy Prime Minister saying that one wasn't needed at all.
I don't think it's necessary.
Remember though, when the government finally made their announcement, it was 2018. It's been 1,200 days since that press conference, and legislation still has not been introduced into Parliament. When you dive into what's taking so long, you see the fascinating story of a government doing everything it can to delay, and delay. The government's initial announcement also kicked off the first round of consultation. Essentially, a brief proposal was released which explained how their integrity commission would work, and they asked for feedback from experts and the public. When the first round of consultation ended soon after, in February 2019, the government had received 78 written submissions. Submissions are what the government calls the responses it gets back. These submissions were from organisations like the Law Council, judges, state and territory governments, and various think tanks. From my reading of these submissions, the overwhelming majority criticised the government's model. The government was then meant to consider this feedback and incorporate any changes into the actual legislation that would be introduced into Parliament. This draft legislation is called the Exposure Draft. So far, so good. But then the delays started. Christian Porter, then the Attorney General of Australia, was responsible for the creation of the Commonwealth Integrity Commission. His plan was to release the exposure draft for a second round of consultation, again for experts to review it. But almost 6 months after the first round of consultation had ended, there was still no sign of the exposure draft.
And it will be done in reasonable period of time. It'll be done a lot quicker than the promise that you made as to when you would do it. It'll be a lot quicker than the 12 months that you promised, but a reasonable period of time needs to be taken for this, and it will be taken.
Eventually, a time frame was given for the exposure draft to be released by the end of 2019.
As to the when, I would expect that we will have a full draft out for public consultation in the not too distant future. I'd expect that would be before the end of the year.
The exposure draft was in fact finalised and given to Christian Porter in December 2019, 1 year after the CIC had been announced. But he still didn't release it.
We've just checked our records, and I think it was December 2019.
Wow,
we
so it was last year that
he's
been sitting on it since last year.
When asked about it in January 2020, he said he hadn't released it over the holiday period because that's apparently not a good time to start a process of consultation, which is an interesting excuse given the first round of consultation was released in December 2018 over the holiday period. Instead, Christian Porter said he had decided to release it early in the new year. But that never ended up happening. Fast forward to May 2020 and COVID was becoming the government's priority. Christian Porter started saying that the government's focus was to keep Australians safe and protect jobs. He said the draft legislation to establish the Commonwealth Integrity Commission was ready for release to allow for consultations before the global economic and health crisis caused by the coronavirus. In October 2020, COVID was still being used as the excuse for why the exposure draft had not been released, which remember was ready and sitting on Christian Porter's desk for 10 months at this point.
The fact that we chose not to conduct that consultation during the height of a global pandemic seemed to be, to us, a matter of some common sense.
It may escape the attention of the Leader of the Opposition that when serious crises confront this nation, it's the entire government, Mr Speaker, that comes together, the entire public service that comes together to act on a whole-of-government basis, Mr Speaker, to deal with that crisis. And that is what our government has done.
Now, Mr Speaker, I was not going to have one public servant diverted from the task of focusing on our
Members on my
holistic
left.
approach to dealing with this pandemic, Mr Speaker, as the Leader of the Opposition would suggest.
He didn't want to divert a single person from the COVID response? Given it's Scott Morrison saying this, it's not surprising that it is completely misleading. The government didn't let COVID stop it from introducing and passing numerous other non-COVID related legislation. For example, the government introduced this legislation in May 2020. Its purpose was to ban asylum seekers from having mobile phones. Or this legislation that the government introduced in August 2020 to pass on environmental approvals to the states. Or what about the federal government supporting Clive Palmer's lawsuit against Western Australia around the same time? These are just a handful of examples, but more than 90 bills had been passed by the time Scott Morrison stood up and said no public servant was being diverted away from the COVID response. COVID was just an excuse. The reality was that the government did not want to prioritise an integrity commission. Here is the Attorney General's department confirming that had they been asked to prioritise it, that's what they would have done.
If the attorney had asked you to prioritise the Integrity Commission, you would have deployed people to do so.
Of course.
Thank you.
Around the same time the government was spinning these excuses, its own senators didn't even know what was going on. Here is Senator Jared Rennick saying he doesn't support an integrity commission, almost 2 years after his own government committed to putting one in place.
No, we don't support a National Integrity Commission. Sorry, Tom,
sure.
just
go briefly.
I don't want unelected bureaucrats. I don't want unelected bureaucrats to have the right to tap my telephone in the same way they've tapped Gladys Berejiklian's private telephone conversations. So if that's the sort of powers you want, Murray, I'm not surprised, because that's typical of Labor and a command and control.
That tapping of the phone.
Okay. Sorry, Tom? Sorry, Tom?
I mean, that was a tapping of Darryl Maguire. Obviously, the Premier was caught up in it, but it was his phone being tapped, right?
Well, that's exactly right. So she had no idea she was being recorded either.
I think that any member of the public would support the activities of ICAC and other corruption bodies in having uncovered what seems to be corruption involving a New South Wales Liberal MP. Without those powers, we would never have known what Darryl Maguire was up to. He would still be a member of the Liberal Party government in New South Wales.
In November 2020, after intense pressure on the government, the exposure draft was finally released for what was called the second round of consultation. This was 2 years after it was first announced.
Morning everyone, and thanks for being here. So today on the website, I think a few minutes ago, the release of the draft bill for the Commonwealth Integrity Commission was made available.
This is the exposure draft. It's the full legislation the government intends to introduce into Parliament. It's over 300 pages long, and in its second round of consultation, the government was again asking for feedback from experts to identify any improvements. This second round of consultation ended in February 2021 and resulted in 333 written submissions being received. Like the first round, basically every submission criticised the exposure draft. But a pattern started to emerge. A lot of people started noticing that their feedback in the first round of consultation had been completely ignored. Nothing major had changed since then. Keep this in mind because it started becoming clear that the government didn't actually care about the feedback. It's also really important to stress that I didn't see a single submission out of the 333 that said, "This is great, you've got the model right." And then the delays started again. A month after the second round of consultation ended, Christian Porter stepped down as the Attorney General of Australia. This was after he launched a defamation lawsuit against the ABC for publishing this article. That lawsuit would ultimately end his political career. Liberal Senator Michaelia Cash became the new Attorney General, and the responsibility for the Commonwealth Integrity Commission became hers. But months later, there was still no legislation introduced into Parliament.
Well, thank you, Mr President. And Senator Patrick, a nationwide consultation process on the legislation to establish the Commission has recently been completed. There were approximately 333 written submissions received and 46 consultations, meetings and roundtables that occurred during the consultation period. The government will carefully consider the feedback received through this extensive consultation process to inform further refinement of the draft legislation before it is introduced into the Parliament.
I guess it's reasonable for the government to take a bit of extra time, given that there was a massive amount of feedback, and all those changes would need time to update. After months and months, in November 2021, 3 years after the proposal was announced, and 9 months after the second round of consultation had ended, we were finally going to get an update.
To have the attorney here as well for what is a very important announcement.
And that is why we will be introducing legislation, the social media anti-trolling legislation.
Wait, what? Another issue was again given priority over a National Integrity Commission. As a side note, this so-called anti-trolling legislation isn't about protecting children from trolling, even though that's how the government has tried to sell it. It's about making defamation lawsuits easier. But that's a whole separate video.
Our proposal has been consulted on. We've had it out there for a long time. We're interested in a fair dinkum commission that looks at criminal conduct, not on whose people's boyfriends are.
Okay, here we go. They're talking about the Integrity Commission now. It's true, there has been consultation for a long period of time.
At this point in time, the bill is as it stands, with exactly as you said.
And why have you gone about consulting for months and months after the original proposal was, I suppose, widely criticised, only to say you're not changing it at all?
We took on board all of the relevant feedback, but we have determined the model that we have put in place is a fair model. It is a balanced model, and as the Prime Minister said, it will deal with instances of the most serious criminal corruption at a federal level. That is what this bill is all about.
Saying we took on board all of the relevant feedback is an interesting way to express that they ignored over 300 submissions and didn't end up changing a single word in the exposure draft. But maybe I just misunderstood the Attorney General's response. Surely, the entire consultation process wasn't just a time-wasting farce where all the experts were ignored.
Does the latest version address any of the concerns that arose during consultation?
As I've stated, and we've been very clear, the model that the government has finalised is the model that is currently available.
Thanks, Minister. I realise the model is the model, but I'm asking, does the most recent version address any of the issues that were raised in the consultation periods?
Well, the government believes that the model that it has is the appropriate model.
That is not, so clearly not, the question that I'm asking.
Well, the government believes that the model that it has, Chair, is the appropriate model.
I'm sure you do believe that, but I'm not interested in that. I'm asking whether or not any of the versions that you delayed for years under the premise of consultation have actually incorporated any change based on that
well, the
very
government
convenient
has
consultation.
The feedback, and we believe that the model that we have is the right model.
The exposure draft for this bill has now been out for consultation for well over a year. After all that consultation, Ms Bogart, can you point us to any significant differences between the exposure draft that was put out for consultation and the settled model, or what the Prime Minister tabled in the House last year?
So I can confirm that what the Prime Minister tabled in the House was the exposure draft that was released on the 2nd of November 2020.
So there were no changes?
No, there were not.
Wow. So, Minister, not one issue raised in the consultation process was taken into account by the government before tabling its legislation?
The government considered the feedback and determined that the model that it has is the appropriate model.
And that everyone who put in a submission saying it was terrible was wrong, and you were right?
Yep. The government considered the feedback and determined that the model that it has is the appropriate model.
Right. Thanks, Chair.
It's a little disrespectful to completely ignore every ounce of advice and not even provide a sort of summary of we've decided X. When some of the commentary on this exposure draft that may or may never end up being a bill introduced as an appallingly weak sham designed to hide corruption. That's from the Centre for Public Integrity, which is, a think tank led by former senior Australian judges with experience in integrity matters.
Well, Senator, there were a number of different viewpoints as part of the consultation process.
She's right about that last part. There were a number of different views. But what she failed to mention was that they all had the same theme: that the government's model was rubbish. Again, not one submission that I read agreed with the government's proposal. So what was the point of consultation then? The government's excuse for continued delay was that the legislation was complex and needed consultation to get right. Yet when that feedback was provided, there was no changes at all. The government had a problem. Its massively overdue Integrity Commission had no support from the experts and had been exposed as a farce. But even then, it didn't want to introduce its weak legislation to Parliament. So when asked about why there was no Integrity Commission in sight, a surprising new excuse emerged.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Last week, the Prime Minister said the National Anti-Corruption Commission he promised in December 2018 could be legislated before the election. Now, the Attorney-General has confirmed the government will not put legislation to Parliament this term. Why won't the Prime Minister do his job and deliver an anti-corruption commission?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've tabled our legislation for that Integrity Commission. We have tabled it, Mr. Speaker. The Labor Party don't support it, and that's why it's not proceeding.
So apparently, it's Labor's fault that an anti-corruption body isn't being introduced by the government.
Mr. Speaker, I have here our bill. I will. About 350 pages
members
here,
on my
Mr. Speaker,
left.
of a detailed, well-designed Commonwealth Integrity Commission, Mr. Speaker. There's $150 million which has been put aside in the budget, Mr. Speaker, through the budget process to ensure that that can be implemented. We have done the work to ensure that an effective Integrity Commission can be implemented in this country, and there's only one obstacle to that being passed in this parliament. The Labor Party, Mr. Speaker. The Labor Party don't support this model. They don't want this model, Mr. Speaker. They want to be able to turn these matters into some sort of kangaroo court, Mr. Speaker, where it can be used for politicking and game playing, Mr. Speaker. If you wish to support a serious proposal, here it is. I table it for the members of the House.
Another quick side note. You would have heard a bunch of references to legislation being tabled. This doesn't mean much. It just means that the government has presented their exposure draft in Parliament. But it was already a public document, so tabling it is meaningless. What needs to happen is for the legislation to be introduced so that it can be debated and then voted on.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the Opposition would be pleased to grant leave.
What's the point of order? The Leader of the Opposition, is it on a point of order?
I'm offering leave for the Prime Minister to introduce the legislation. We can debate it now.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The government's not seeking leave.
Anthony Albanese, the opposition leader, even offered the government a chance to introduce the legislation so it can be debated. But of course that didn't happen. The narrative that Labor doesn't support us is just too convenient for the government. And it's not just Scott Morrison, it's the entire government using the same lines.
Well, I think the Prime Minister's been very clear, as has the Attorney-General. If the Labor Party are prepared to support the legislation that is currently before them, then we will bring it into the Parliament and we'll pass it as quickly.
The government wheeled all its ministers out to say the same thing. Simon Birmingham gave an interview saying, if Labor can come on board, then it can go forward. And Stuart Roberts said, we've made it very clear we will pass this bill with Labor support. It's there for them to support us and they've decided against it. But here's the thing, the experts don't support the coalition's proposal, so why would Labor or the crossbench? That makes no sense, especially given how unwilling the government is to fix their own model. But more importantly, how is this a legitimate excuse for the government? Since when does the government wait for Labor's support before introducing legislation? The answer is that they don't. That's not how things work. Remember those bills that the government introduced to Parliament during the early months of the pandemic, despite saying that not a single public servant would be diverted away? Labor didn't support either of those bills and voted against them, but that didn't stop their introduction and passage through the House of Representatives. And there are numerous other examples. This is nothing more than a convenient fantasy to delay things even further. And that's where we're at now. The government has used every excuse in the book, every delaying tactic they could find, to stretch this out since 2018. And they've now confirmed that they will not introduce their legislation before the next election. Now, I've claimed the government's proposal is rubbish a few times so far, but in the next video, I'm going to go through in detail exactly what makes the whole thing a complete joke. In the meantime though, this tweet from a Scott Morrison parody account on Twitter seems to capture the mood pretty well. If you made it to the end, then thank you. These videos take ages to make, and right now I'm a one-man show. If you'd like to help support this channel grow, consider checking out my new Patreon page. Links are in the description below.